hearing these presentations. I'm on the docket to start first, so I guess I will go first, and I will try to police myself. Daria set us instructions. She said to keep it to 10 minutes, so I will do my absolute best to do that. So share screen. Oh, it says I can't share. Okay, is it now? Can I share now? Okay, so I have a little PowerPoint that I'll run through pretty quickly. So the title of my presentation is From Greater Europe to Greater Eurasia, Status, Concerns, and the Evolution of Russia's Approach to Regional Integration. So this is a paper I am developing for a special issue of the Journal of Eurasian Studies that we're doing with, I'm co-editing with Richard Sakwa, and we have a number of papers here. Richard was supposed to also participate when this was scheduled in Moscow way back when and before life changed for all of us. And Timofey also has a paper in this edited volume. And the big question I ask, since our special issue is devoted to Greater Eurasia, which we hear a lot about now, right? The concept of kind of integrating this Eurasian heartland. But the question I ask, the puzzle I start with is, why has Russia's approach to regional integration undergone so many transformations over time? And if I look at it, and these dates are very rough here, I'm still working on the paper, I see 5 different kind of periods. The first period, so the initial post-Soviet period, Kozyrev is the foreign minister, Yeltsin's early part of Yeltsin's presidency. Just a lack of complete interest, a kind of rejection of Eurasian integration in favor of Russia's integration with the West. So really, a total lack of interest in Eurasian integration. And then this changed. The second period I see is one of benign neglect. So this is this initial period under Primakov's stewardship, also the early Putin period. Here we have a lot of this kind of institution building. There's a focus on integration again, but it's not very effective, and not a lot of investment really is being made in it. So, you have the CIS, and it's declaring itself as being the EU of the East, but it's not doing much. Something like 90%, only but 10% of all the different measures and laws and stuff passed by the CIS is actually ratified by the parliaments. Trade, interregional trade as a percentage of Russia's trade continues to decline, where 75% of Russia's trade is interregional in 1994. By 1999, that's down to 28%. And of course, you have countries trying to escape this kind of Russian-led integration projects, and Russia not paying much attention to that. The third period I see is from 2003 to 2010, and this is where there's more serious efforts at regional integration. Of course, this is where the customs union has started. This multi-level approach is going from this kind of CIS catch-all sort of approach to a kind of multi-level approach where you first work with the states that are actually interested, such as Belarus and Kazakhstan, and then kind of expand, and focusing on very kind of clear issues, right? So a customs union leading to some kind of laws being coordinated, all these kinds of things, right? But the overall thrust of it is still this kind of project of integrating Russia into Europe, right? So the idea of, as Richard Sakwa has called it, an integration of integrations, right? So this Eurasian integration will lead to this kind of overall integration into Europe, and you'll have a greater Europe from Dublin to Vladivostok. And then there's another shift where it becomes much more focused on the Eurasian Economic Union itself. Goes away from this kind of integration of integrations to Eurasian Economic Union, and this being kind of this concept that this could be enough for Russia to emerge as one of the poles in the multipolar world. So a de-emphasis on integration of integrations and more on Eurasian integration, Eurasian Union. And then finally, this is morphed, I would argue, from 2014 on to the idea of a greater Eurasia. So this is not a Eurasia from Dublin to Vladivostok, but from Minsk to Shanghai, where you have regional integration as a vehicle for creating this kind of alternative political economic space in partnership, very importantly, with China, other Eurasian powers, and sort of as a counterpoint to a declining West, right? So the puzzle is why? How can we explain these kind of transformations and changes? And for people that know me and know my work, no surprise, right? I trace it to the importance of status, right? So I argue in this paper that really it's status that's played a decisive role in shaping these kind of choices and what the concept, right, what kind of the ideas about integration are being sort of put forward, right? And so, you know, surprisingly, if one looks at this literature on integration, and my early work, you know, has also dealt with it. I didn't talk much about status. Status really takes a back seat, right? Most of it is about, you know, either the kind of realist security approach, you know, kind of Mearsheimer. He always argues that regional integration is the first thing a great power has to do. And a number of works of kind of, I think Timofey's work, he's not here, so I can talk about his work, kind of has leaned towards this kind of security direction. Or there's kind of an economic approach. I made an economic argument in one of my early papers that this actually kind of made sense, that other regional powers were also doing it. Then there's this kind of identity perspective. Somebody like Andrei Tsigankov would maybe stress that. And then also this kind of more critical that this is imperial nostalgia. But none of these really, I think, systematically really deal with status, and they certainly don't deal with status as it's developed within international relations. So there, you know, is a school, T.V. Paul being one of the main guys working in this area, Bill Wohlforth as well, Debbie Larson and Alexei Shevchenko talk about status in Russia and Russian foreign policy. Xiao Yu-pu, Chinese scholars, just come out with a great book, Rebranding China, where he talks about status in Chinese foreign policy. So I see status as the big motivation here. But before you would kind of link this to issues of identity and imperial nostalgia, I want to also make sure that, you know, I see status as not just being something that states seek for social psychological reasons, but also for instrumental reasons. When you have status, you can actually get things done. It's really status, we could argue, and you know, Robert Gilpin very early on argued it. He called it prestige. That was the currency of international relations. So when you have status, states defer to you. You get what you want done. And I take a very, you know, I start with, you know, my operational definition of status is very much based in this kind of status literature. So it's a country's, you know, ranking in the eyes of states and statesmen in some kind of international hierarchy based on its possession of valued attributes like military strength or economic power or, you know, culture, rule of law, these kinds of things. And, you know, the argument I'm making here is that being a leader of regional integration and also associating with other great powers is something that does give you status. And also arguing that, you know, status is of particular importance to great powers, right? You know, great powers really vie for status much more than other states do. You know, there's a lot of work that shows that, you know, even smaller states like status and do vie for status. Ivar Neumann and wrote a piece about Norway and status not too long ago. I would argue that it's really something that great powers kind of fight over, and especially great powers such as Russia that are trying to, you know, struggling to establish themselves kind of in this international hierarchy, right? It being important to them, right? So if you're a great power, right, great power comes with a lot of prerogatives that you want to exercise and responsibilities. And if status is the currency of international relations, you want it, right? So I'm arguing that status isn't something Russia wants just for these kind of social, psychological, or, you know, frivolous, for lack of a better term, reasons, but it's something that actually kind of enhances your power. So if we look at the different periods, I would argue that the changes, right, the adoption of the kind of strategy towards integration, as well as kind of rejection of that strategy and moving on to another strategy, is influenced by status considerations, right? So the first period is this kind of Kozyrev, early Yeltsin period. So really, you know, the choice is made that, you know, Russia wants to reestablish itself as a great power. And doing so, it finds, you know, this greater status gains are by becoming a part of the advanced West, becoming a normal country, transforming Russia itself into a normal country, and association with the post-Soviet states and also with other non-Western states is seen as something that would detract from it, right? These are backward states. Usually they're not democracies, right? They're kind of despotic. So, you know, joining and integrating with them is something that is rejected, right? In favor of joining the West. Also, not wanting to do, you know, throwing off what was, you know, an looked at those times as an imperial burden to focus on developing, democratizing, transforming Russia, right? However, Russia wasn't able, you know, relatively early on, this was kind of apparent, to really integrate using this kind of strategy. It wasn't accepted into the West, and it also wasn't able to really kind of find the place inside that Western hierarchy that was in line with its status aspirations, right? So Russia would have to not only take a back seat to the US, which I guess would be acceptable as a junior partner considering how powerful the US was at that time, but also since status within this Western community of nations, you know, it's not just depending on material power, it also is about adherence to certain kind of standards of democracy, human rights, capitalism. Russia also was relatively weak to those, on those, right? So it would have to take a backseat to countries such as Germany, Japan in that status hierarchy, Great Britain as well, right? And that wasn't acceptable. So the shift then became, you know, more of an intention to reintegration of the post-Soviet space, seeing that as a valuable kind of tool for Russia's status. But throughout this time of benign kind of neglect, really the focus isn't so much. So this is kind of the Primakov period and the early Putin period. You know, there's a lot of this institution building inside the CAS, a lot of these efforts, but the investment really isn't made in that. Under Primakov, Russia is still very weak and incapable of exercising kind of, you know, its economic tools in a kind of coherent way. But also the focus, especially on status seeking for Russia, is much more as kind of balancing the United States. Remember Primakov, that's why I have him here with Kissinger, right? He tried to practice his own kind of version of trilateralism, right? To establish this partnership with India and China that would kind of balance and counter Western power. So the focus is more on that. And then with Putin, during his initial presidency, right, the initial kind of beginnings of the presidency, well, the focus is on rebuilding Russian power, right? So it's not on, you know, kind of being willing to invest or make sacrifices towards integration. It's, you know, modernizing the economy in Russia, rebuilding the Russian state, right? So this is a period where, you know, you have not much of an interest in this, you know, regional integration. Also, the focus really, and this is, you know, this early period after 9/11, is on developing some kind of partnership with the United States, right? This would give Russia a lot of status, right? You know, Russia, America's big ally in the global war on terror. Russia, there was even an idea that would emerge as a good energy supplier of the United States. Of course, that fails, right? Russia isn't accepted by the United States as a partner. And so there's a shift, a renewed shift towards Eurasian integration, taken much more seriously, right? So the shift is away from partnership with the United States, more of an emphasis on partnership and, you know, this kind of ideas about Russia integrating with Europe. And Eurasian integration playing the role of kind of strengthening Russia's hand, right? So Russia integrating with these other countries so it would be able to bargain a better integration into Europe, right? So this is, you know, a period where actually some progress is made, right? There's a shift towards these more functional, pragmatic institutions like, you know, away from the CIS towards the customs union, the Eurasian Economic Community, and then you had this, you know, transformation now of the Eurasian Union. So all of these things are done. There's a jump in inter-regional trade. So from 2010 to 2009 to 2012, trade between the members of the customs union actually increases by over 70%. So there are some sort of successes here. But again, this kind of strategy runs into a bit of a wall in that, you know, Russia really sort of isn't, right, accepted into Europe because of this Eurasian integration, right? So Russia still is, you know, kind of in this tutelary role, right? It's still the student, right? It's not getting.
I'm sorry,
integrated.
it's nearly time.
Yes. It's nearly time. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me go over. You know, the prerogative of the speaker is you can go over a little bit, okay? So Russia isn't sort of accepted into this. So the shift goes into, you know, this kind of integration of post-Soviet space as being where Russia will find its status, right? A pole in a multipolar world, right? Since, you know, it's been rejected by Europe. Where this runs into a wall is with Ukraine, right? Once Ukraine isn't a potential part of this project, this post-Soviet integration really doesn't make much sense. It really doesn't add much to Russia's power and status. And then secondly, it finds that really, you know, these efforts at economic integration kind of start to falter, right? Trade actually starts going down between these countries, right? Sorry, I don't have the statistics available here, but we know that, you know, this kind of early boost we got from customs union, that's gone into decline. And then Russia has a lot of trouble with these guys that are supposed to be kind of its satellites within this kind of post-Soviet space, right? They don't recognize the annexation of Crimea. They also don't follow Russia's policies of trying to impose through Eurasian Union economic sanctions against Ukraine. And Russia finds that it has a lot of these kind of difficulties with these states. And many times these guys are getting the upper hand on Russia, right? So the realization is we're not going to get much status by integrating with these small players, minus Ukraine, this post-Soviet space. This kind of Eurasian integration doesn't give us much status. So now there's going to be an expanded idea of creating a greater Eurasia, right? In partnership with these other great powers, right? So this grants Russia status, firstly, because this is really some kind of grand historical project, right? This is kind of a Macinderian project of integrating the heartland, right? Making it the center of economic gravity in the world, where it's been, the center of gravity has been on the periphery, right? The rimland, which is controlled by the West. And secondly, it gives you get status by associating with other more dynamic rising powers, India, but first and foremost, China, right? So Debbie Larson, one of her recent articles that came out of International Politics, she calls this a status partnership between Russia and China, where they both kind of accentuate their strengths and kind of make up for their weaknesses by having this partnership. So this is the current sort of configuration of it. So the main takeaways I'll run into just first, this highlights the importance of status in regional integration, how it shapes status seeking, so how it shapes regional integration strategy. So that's not something that that's really been treated in the regionalism literature in international relations. Also, it shows, that status concerns have often, kind of trumped other concerns about economics and security in terms of the choices. So the early period of neglect was, kind of went against, neglect of integration in favor of integration. The West neglected, and it caused all these kind of security problems to arise in the post-Soviet space. The economic, right? Probably the economically rational idea would be maybe to integrate more with Europe, right? Would continue a European path towards integration. And certainly, Europe continues to be Russia's main economic partner. But again, status considerations have kind of trumped these. And then finally, the kind of argument is that this greater Eurasia strategy currently adopted, a lot will depend, the success of it, and Russia's commitment to it is how it fulfills these status aspirations. And that's not necessarily assured because, there's the danger, of course, of Russia becoming the junior partner here. There's the danger also of, many of these states, Russia losing a lot of its sphere of influence in the post-Soviet region. Already for, the Central Asian states, China, for all of them except for Kazakhstan, China is their #1 trading partner. So that's it for me. Should we move on to other presentations, or should we take questions?
Yes, Andre, can you hear me?
Yes, I do. Hello.
Yes,
oh!
I must apologize to everybody for joining
Sure.
a little bit later. I was on one of those terribly long and overlapping online meetings, and I appreciate very much, Andre, for the fact that you have started to chair this session. With your permission, I will jump in for a short while. Then I'll need to leave again.
Okay.
I'm very sorry, but since I can abuse some rights of the moderator,
yes.
Before I ask the other colleagues for the question, can I also ask a question, please?
Of course.
Yes. The question is, well, I missed the beginning of your the beginning of your presentation, and I think that you have developed an excellent thesis and excellent angle to look at Russia's foreign policy during the last almost 20 years, even more than 20 years. Though for me, it's yet not particularly clear how do you put the category of status into the wider framework of nations, of the state's power. So could it be possible to consider the status as one of the elements or dimensions of power, and which every state is seeking to rise whilst being in the constant competition with the other states? So, but if yes, if we do see status as one of the elements of the state accommodate general power, why do we consider it as something particular, and why do we don't speak about that Russia's initial goal is to increase Russia's power? Yes. And seeking for status is just one of the elements of this general struggle. This is the first question. The second question is about this more technical one, is about status considerations and Eurasian Economic Union. As all we know, Russia, within the Eurasian Economic Union decision-making, Russia enjoys the same, formally the same rights as little Armenia or Kyrgyzstan. So how do you see that this is just a side product of this Russia's power seeking, or you think that it might represent some new approaches and some new vision of Russia about what is the power of the country? So I want to say that it could have been said that for Russia, power is to control those smaller member states, but for Russia, it might be considered as a status to put itself on the formally equal ground with these states, and thus enjoy the new quality of its foreign policy, very different from the centuries-long tradition of the power domination over its neighborhood.
Well, thank you for those excellent questions. So the first one is, of course, very challenging. This is if you read TV Paul's volume on status, the kind of seminal work, you also have Bill Thompson and David Lake. They make the same argument, right? That status is nothing but power. But I would argue that, it's hard because it isn't just this utilitarian power dimension. It also has this social psychological dimension where it is important for people's self-esteem. Hello, guys. I will turn off my camera. I'm sorry. Somehow I got cut off. Do you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. This happens with this laptop. It was one provided by HSE, by the way. So maybe it shouldn't be so surprising. So, so the first thing is that there's this. So there's this social psychological dimension to status, right? That you can't really tease away from the utilitarian power dimension. And then secondly, we can kind of, going back to, the ancient Greeks or even Hobbes, right? He saw mankind as having, three motivations. Diffidence was one, which basically meant fear, right? The need for security. Greed was the other, right? For material possessions, and glory, right? And glory is something that, glory, your position in society, over others. So there is that psychological kind of social psychological self-esteem dimension that you can't really separate. And then you can't, I think, really talk about it just in terms of being power, right? Russia looking at and finding power. That's certainly, I guess, a way you could conceptualize it. And then expanding power beyond just material factors, and it could mesh with soft power, but I stick with the status. The other question is this of, Armenia so Russia putting itself on an equal status within these institutions, right? One country, one vote. Yeah, I guess that is true, but I do think that Russia does position itself as the leader of this, regional grouping. And then in practice, right, not everything is just decided through institutions, right? We know that, in fact, a lot of these relations, economic and otherwise, are done bilaterally. Actually, there have been a number of papers recently that have made the argument that the bilateral, that most of the action is bilateral, which is natural for a larger, stronger country to want to do things bilaterally instead of in multilateral formats. But that use of bilateral relations has undermined the union itself and the institutions of the union. But I expect to hear more about this in your paper that I still haven't read for the Journal of Eurasian Studies. Please get that to me as soon as you can.
Yeah, very good timing for this reminder. Okay. With your permission, I invite our friend Yuval Weber to join us for this discussion. Yuval?
I will stop sharing the screen. Sorry, I just don't know how to stop. Maybe Daria can step in. Stop share. Okay.
It's an above, yeah.
Okay.
So hello, everyone. Let me see if I can do the same thing. So while I get going, I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Professor Bordachev for the gracious invitation, and to Daria for the coordination so far. So let me just see if I can get this going. So what does this look like? Run, share, full screen. Okay. Are you seeing a PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. So let me just see if I can then do play. Okay, great. So you can see taking Russia, China, and great power seriously.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you to everyone for taking time out of your afternoons. Thank you to Timofey for the invitation. So really what I'm going to talk about today is, I have a pretty long presentation, so I won't get through most of it. But what I want to talk about was Russia, China, in terms of what is the burden sharing between the two great powers, and how to take great power competition seriously. And obviously what we have is, I just added this a few minutes ago because I saw that once Andrei had a humorous picture of Putin to begin his talk, I thought it was then important that I respect tradition and also add this picture. And that is a picture taken by a journalist friend. And this is from March 2014, actually when all the events of Euromaidan and Crimea was happening. She went down to Sevastopol and took this picture of obviously the owner of that car being very excited about the events in Ukraine and Crimea, and put basically that picture, popular success kid meme on the car itself. So really, in terms of thinking about what is great power competition, the pictures on the right, even before I get to what the talk is about, that is what it looks like from the perspective of Washington, of the United States. That Russia and China are one. You can see on the bottom, both of them together will balance the United States, and that obviously what China, represented by President Xi, brings is technology. What Vladimir Putin and Russia bring is the oil. And that's basically high technology, low technology. So we all think that great power competition is sort of just the natural course of events, and that's fine. There's no sort of complaint about that. But what we often do, and what this paper and what this presentation is not about, is not really about the great power confrontation between United States and Russia, United States and China, and how Russia and China can work together or not work together. Because what is really sort of like the greatest percentage of international politics is the development and maintenance of hierarchical alliance networks. So when we think about the great power confrontation between the three great powers of the world, that is in effect at the realm of anarchy. These countries, Russia, China, United States, which have independent foreign policies, they're the ones who are making international politics and not taking it. But as we know, there are very few countries in which that is actually true. It's basically everyone but these three. So when focusing on what does hierarchy look like in international relations, we can have a sense of making a comment on Russia, China, and the burden sharing in that relationship, but from an indirect observation. So in a sense, just to give you what the entire presentation is about, the burden sharing in the Russia-China relationship is uneven. And when thinking about allies, Russia's allies are much deeper, but they're much fewer. China has a much more wide-ranging network through its One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road Initiative. It's had different names over the time. So it has more, but much shallower allies. And when we think about what is the theme of this particular panel, about the adaptation of Russia's foreign policy, it's going to be very difficult. And that's because Russia, like anything else, has three options. It can go it alone in international politics, and that's difficult because of the three big countries, Russia, China, United States, it is by far the least wealthy of those three, which is not to say anything negative about Russia. It's one of the world's top 10 or top 20 economies. But in terms of having an active international agenda, the resources and capabilities of Russia are far less than its two competitors at this level. So going it alone is difficult. Conceding to the West, and one of the reasons I put that picture of Crimea is, what does conceding to the West look like? That means saying, the war in Ukraine is over and Crimea can go back, it can leave the Russian Federation and re-enter Ukraine. In reality, this is completely unacceptable. So in order to maintain Crimea and all the active research, all the active foreign policy agenda of the Russian Federation, giving that up would mean that President Putin would probably find himself out of power. So that's also not going to be likely. And so the third option, and really sort of the least bad option, and what Andrei was talking about a moment ago, is about the continued partnership with China. And this also has both its pros and its cons. And it's good that Andrei went before this, because his talk about status in international affairs is in fact at the core of the Russia-China relationship, as opposed to Russia going it alone or trying to make a renewed partnership with the West on Western grounds or by the prerogatives of the West. Because what China does in a positive sense is it respects the status concerns of Russia through and through. What all the data and the empirical results that I'm about to show you demonstrates that China absolutely disrespects Russia on a material basis. And what Andrei talked about a moment ago in terms of China in Central Asia already being the main economic partner of these countries, it actually goes in several different dimensions as well, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So what we have, and this is the whole sort of the theme of Timofey's questions as well, is we have a way of determining what is more important in the Russia-China relationship. Is it ideational factors, in which status is more important, or is it material factors, in which things such as trade relationships, security relationships are more important? Russia, so Central Asia is actually the way where we can test this out over the coming years. And because this is also about the internal factors to Russia's foreign policy adaptation, we don't obviously have all the data, but we can imagine that actually COVID-19, this coronavirus, is going to be the biggest challenge, I would think, of President Putin's entire time in office, really going back even to 1999 and the beginnings of the Second Chechen War. Because unlike the Chechen War, unlike the opposition, the financial collapse in 2008, sanctions in 2014, plus everything having to do with Crimea and Ukraine, this COVID-19 is going to be, in fact, probably the most expensive thing that Russia will spend its money on in the preceding generation, because there is no bottom to what the government will have to do in order to maintain some amount of stability. Now, the reserves are huge. It's $500 billion up to $1 trillion when you include, all the gold, all the foreign reserves. But is that going to be enough? Not just to get out of COVID-19, but also to prepare the government for whatever is going to happen in terms of whatever the nature of political transition in 2024 or not. So in a sense, does Russia have enough money to maintain a status quo indefinitely? And because if it can maintain the status quo indefinitely inside the country, that'll still give it the open hand to operate abroad. So what the paper that this is based upon is about how to measure hierarchy in international affairs. And just to give you a sense of what the actual data say, China's rise that we hear about a lot is to the detriment of Russia in Central Asia and to the United States in Asia Pacific. And really what it does is it limits the economic choices of subordinate countries and then moves on to political choices and then security choices. Russia and China work well together because they have one common interest. That is to resist US hegemony and to resist the US foreign policy agenda. This is true through and through, but the nature of that cooperation is still untested at the substructural level. And Andrei gave you one scenario in which this is actually going to work positively for both countries. What I'm going to suggest is it's going to work out worse for Russia. Now, this is not to say that Russia is naive or that I am naive or that any of you are naive. What I am saying is the least bad option is still bad, to maintain Russia's status as one of the top countries in international affairs. So, and for the United States, where obviously I live, the existing US hierarchies in Asia and Europe are still strong, but what I personally see in the data and what I think in terms of living here is that we have reached basically the end of US domination of international affairs. And the shift to multipolarity, I think began before President Trump, but I think what President Trump has done is accelerated through his very special style of governing. And that we are going to have multipolarity sooner rather than later. And this is actually going to be perhaps a more violent period of international affairs. But really, what do we think about for Russian foreign policy? It's about capital. It's about money. Does Russia have enough money to maintain stability at home and maintain enough ability to make friends and influence states abroad? So I probably don't have enough time to go through all of these, But really the most important thing that I want to talk about when thinking about hierarchy is that, from Waltz and from realism, we believe that we believe that anarchy is the state of the world. Because there's no world government, all states are motivated to behave in the same way, self-preservation and so forth. That all states are most jealous of guarding their sovereignty. What we can actually see is that that state of affairs, of anarchy, of independent foreign policies, as I suggested, it's only for a very small number of countries. How many countries in the world today can you think of which really make decisions in international affairs? It's effectively Russia, China, United States, and for certain issues, perhaps I don't even know if there's any others. When we think of places like North Korea, they certainly take decisions that are against the US foreign policy agenda, but they take it in relation to trying to work with China and trying to oppose the United States. They're not really making independent decisions about where the country is going. And they've made their country much poorer, so on and so forth. So anarchy is for great powers, hierarchy is from everybody else. And obviously, why care about hierarchy? This is actually most of international affairs. The three that you see from the top three, those are, the first two is about the European Recovery Program, which is the Marshall Plan. That was the official name of the Marshall Plan. And in the middle, SEATO was basically the Marshall Plan for Asia in the post-World War II period. And of course, everyone is probably more familiar with the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led responses to this. And we can see that, in different times, we now think about One Belt, One Road, but China has also worked on international alliances over time. Just to sort of carry on, what does this Hierarchy and Resilience Index actually do? It looks at the four major components of interstate relations: security, diplomacy, economics, and information. And so of these, we can see things like defense pacts, foreign military bases, arms sales, voting together in the UN General Assembly, how many times do each other's leaders visit each other, trade relations, and information relations. So we don't know ahead of time, ex ante, what is most important. So we can have someone like Timofey, hardcore realist, who says, you know what, it's actually security is the most important thing. We can have someone like Andrei, who's much more open to, let's say, information, much more open to this constructivist idea of status. So maybe it's actually information that really defines the relationship between any two countries. So what I've provided for you is 5 different models of how the world can actually look like on a state-to-state basis, where each of the categories is equal, or where security, diplomacy, economics, and information is half of the model, and the other 3 provide 1/6 of the weighting. Just to give you the conclusions, as we'll see in like the pictures, the graphics in the next couple minutes, if we're looking at this on a material basis, not talking about status, not talking about ideational factors, China's rise is to the detriment of Russia, and it is first and foremost as a consequence of the Belt and Road Initiative, the One Belt, One Road. Because what has happened in the data is that the 2008-2009 financial crisis forced Russia, like all countries, to bail out their own economy. That money, which would have otherwise gone for, foreign affairs, increasing influence abroad, because it stayed at home, that was money that did not go to Central Asia, Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and so forth. And what China did is they took that opportunity to really start the Belt and Road much more seriously. And obviously for the same reasons. If China wants to resist the United States, and obviously the United States is causing financial catastrophe everywhere, then the thing that they did was logical. They increased their resilience to the influence of the United States. They increased it at the expense of Russian influence in Central Asia. And what the data also show is that what began in 2008, 2009 is actually confirmed by 2014, because Russia then increased its reserves. It saved the economy. It was, in fact, stable, wealthy country, and rising by the events of Crimea and Ukraine. But the oil price crash and the sanctions regime of 2014, which are independent but happen at the same time, that forced Russia to bail out its economy once more. And that's when basically China completed many of the initial plans for Belt and Road Initiative. And so when we think about Central Asia, it's often called post-Soviet. From 2008 to 2014, that's the transition to pre-China. Russia maintains its political influence, its security influence, but as an economic player, it's done by 2014. And when Andre said it's the main trading partner of the Central Asian states, we can see that by 2014, it's all done. Which means that the Eurasian Economic Union, as a source of great power hierarchy, has likely already peaked. Less relevant to the United States, and what's also relevant here is that the United States, it's faced basically the top of what it can do. The influence of the United States is not zero. It's probably still the strongest country in the world, but it's not really growing. And that's where I said earlier, we're transitioning to multipolarity. We have a stable United States in terms of international power, declining Russia, increasing China, but China and Russia working together. That's the nature of international affairs today. And for the United States, the big problem was, in terms of Europe and Eurasia, the Iraq War. The Iraq War was the inflection point where things started to go badly. And the security and diplomacy changes, again, they happen rarely, but when they do, they're really big. And that's Ukraine, Georgia, NATO expansion. So what we have here is a way of thinking about hierarchy in Europe and Eurasia, and I'll get to Asia Pacific in just a second. So,
sorry, it's nearly time.
Okay, great. So just to conclude, you can see what it looks like here in Europe and Eurasia. Obviously, for Russia, the blue is cold, red is warm. So where is it going blue? Ukraine and Georgia. Where is the United States getting warmer? The places that are new NATO members and places where Russia has been interested in expanding its influence and the United States is confronting it. For China, we can see that these are all the poorer countries of Europe, as well as Central Asia. And for the United States, obviously we can see it is confronting Russia. That's the whole point of NATO, and we see it in the data. For Asia Pacific, just very quickly, as I said, China is basically working with economic factors first. India has not really done very much. Russia does not play as active a role. And for the United States, the failure to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2016 is probably the high water mark of its influence. And so the same thing, and in the question and answer period, I can go over these much more. And just to show you, if we just look at economic indicators, that's what basically Asia Pacific looks like, the increase in China. So really, I've talked a lot about what's going on here, the conclusions of the questions. Happy to answer questions about the actual tool, but really what we have in terms of burden sharing between Russia and China, we will find out over the next coming years whether this relationship is motivated by status and relational factors, or whether it's motivated by material factors. If it's status, then actually Russia and China will solve its internal contradictions. If it's material, then we will see Russia being displaced without really any compensation. And the thing that is going to basically motivate that is whether Russia can maintain its internal stability, whether it'll have enough money from after the COVID-19 reconstruction, economic bailout efforts. And so happy to discuss that further, and I'll give the rest of the time to Timofey. So thank you.
Thank you, Yuval. It was absolutely excellent. lots of interesting ideas and hypotheses. I'm just wondering, I do recall somebody from our field of studies said that solid hypothesis requires solid data.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it genuinely makes sense to look at their, for example, Chinese investment dynamics in Central Asian countries during the last couple of years in order to give some data-based proofs for this pre-China status, pre-China quality of affiliation of these countries, as you suggest, because I'm not absolutely convinced that in the Chinese influence in these countries has materialized significantly over the last couple of years in terms of the investment activities or participation in the local industries or change of the public opinion. So do you think that this sort of data really matters for your analysis, or it is or is not so essential to take it into consideration because of the methodological considerations?
So this is actually an excellent question. And had I sort of like not forgotten to mention, does the HRI index act? How does the hierarchy and resilience index actually work? The second idea of there is resilience. So assuming hierarchy is there's a great power and a subordinate state, any two. Let's not think of just any two specific ones, but just in general. What the hierarchy does is shape, and actually one of the slides that I skipped goes over this. What the hierarchy does is shape the economic, political, security decisions of the subordinate state. That's basically how any sort of relationship works. That's the dyad. So resilience is the ability of that subordinate state to maintain either its ability to say no or to shape that relationship to its benefit. And where hierarchy actually is sustainable, and this is like the work of, like let's say John Eikenberry, is that when the hierarch and David Lake, so when the hierarch and the subordinate are actually bargaining back and forth and can figure out what is the correct sort of burden sharing between them, they can make a sustainable hierarchical relationship. So that hierarchy is not by itself pejorative or negative or bad. It is. They can just work together. So my suggestion for China and Central Asia, the way that the HRI is built, the Hierarchy and Resilience Index is built, is when we think about, voting together at the United Nations or let's say economics, the way that everything is measured is from the perspective of the smaller state. So when we look at, let's say, Kyrgyz Republic or Tajikistan, whichever, it's what is the percentage of Tajikistan's votes that are in accordance, in agreement with Russia, China, US, or whatever? What is the exports of Tajikistan that go to Russia? What is Tajikistan's imports that come from Russia? So all of the data, which is, comes from all sort of reputable sources like, World Bank, IMF, Russian Central Bank, Russian Ministry of Finance. So not like dubious places. It's all measured from the perspective of how much of Tajikistan's politics, economics, security, and informational space is controlled by or dominated by or in relationship to Russia, China, US, or other countries. So that the way that I get towards thinking about Central Asia as being pre-China isn't that Russia did anything different. It's that China did so much more in order to overwhelm these countries on an economic basis. And because I said there's 5 different models, there's a realist model, an equal model, an economic model, and so forth. If we believe that relationships are constructed in international affairs by economics first, we don't know that it is, but let's just give that hypothesis. We can then tell a story in which the economic relationship of Tajikistan to China it becomes so dominated that if China makes a difficult political choice upon Tajikistan, Tajikistan is then in a situation where it only has two choices. We ruin the economy by saying no, or we say yes in order to save the economy. And that's the way that sort of this economic hierarchy can then lead to different political choices. And if China does this repeatedly, well, they can up the ante to security choices. And then they can really sort of have a sense of where Tajikistan stands in international affairs. It's as a subordinate of China. We don't know this. This is just like a series of hypotheses, and it's basically a series of ideas of how international politics works. But if that's the case, that economics is the thing that drives the relationship between two states, which I think it is, that's just my personal opinion, then we have a sense of how Russian influence is displaced. But this will take a long time. What I'm not saying, and what the data do not show, is that Russia is non-existent in Central Asia. In terms of political influence and security influence, it is the dominant external power. But China is the dominant economic power in this region. So that's why I said, in contrast to Andre, if this is a material story, then basically China is going to displace Russia. If this is an ideational story about status and about joint resistance to the United States, then this is not bad at all. We simply don't know, but what the tool here can do is give us several hypotheses to test.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, if we don't have any questions right away, I should invite our friend and colleague from still Ohio University, soon another one, as I do know, Olga. Olga, please. We anticipate your intervention.
Oh, hello. Yes, I just barely unmuted my audio. I'm glad to greet you, dear friends, here, even though we're very far away. It's very funny how technology can bring us all together. And okay, so first of all, let me share my screen. 1 second. Share screen. Okay, so I think that works right now. Okay, so first of all, let me state that Dr. Henry Hale, my colleague from George Washington University, is a co-author of this study. And he's also present today at our conference and at our discussion. I hope he will also take part in the answering following questions. First, a couple of words about our study. So we conducted a study that involved opinion polls in Russia and in the United States at the end of the summer of 2019. We conducted those polls on a comparative instrument in both countries. We polled adults, both in Russia and in the United States, a representative nationwide samples, 1,600 in both countries. In Russia, the data was collected by VCOM, Russian Public Opinion Research Center, and in the United States by YouGov. Both companies are very renowned and respected in both countries. So we conducted actually quite some experiments. I can, given the time limitations, can share with you only some. I will talk mostly about the 3 experiments which were embedded in each of the surveys. These experiments probed attitudes on various aspects of mutual relations between the United States and Russia, and between the audiences in both countries. We tried to assess stability of country favorability between the 2 countries, how various terms that we would use in our experiments, US, West, EU, would invoke different preferences in Russia, for example, and what is the support for the compromise. So first experiment, the least experiment was aimed at, we tried to avoid social desirability bias when we would ask directly, what is your attitude about the country? The second, priming would help us see how we can manipulate favorability, and specifically hostility. For example, we would measure attitudes towards threat and different kind of divergent interests versus basis for good relations, common threads, history, and so on. We have quite some background in our relations between the United States and Russia. And finally, in our framing experiments, we also wanted to dive in a little deeper and assess favorability towards some specific issues, and willingness to compromise on some of the issues which can be bring us apart instead of bringing us together. For example, the question of Ukraine, right? One of the hypotheses here was that in the study, and specifically this experiment, was that we can frame the narratives, and maybe this would differ across the population, different groups of populations in terms of social demographic characteristics. So in terms of the first experiment and framing effects on favorability, our control group finding demonstrated that there is some mutual US-Russia favorability available there. Country favorability, unfortunately, is different in terms of Russia and United States, in terms of how much we can move that needle. In United States, the only framing for Americans which is possible is negative, and especially with regards to Crimea. For example, in the United States, we can move that needle from 69% in the control group to 80% of the control group. So this was negative. In Russia, we see much more positive story, especially if we deal with common interests such as control of fighting terrorism and control of drug trafficking. Russians are much more likely to be subject to positive frames with regards to United States. In terms of impressions towards various kinds of naming, so to say, when we use terms United States versus West or EU, they do evoke different views and preferences among the population. Here, for example, is the data that we had for Russia, for example, right? When we would include different, how stable is the favorability towards the country when included different primes, and would have seen favorability or unfavorability of various circumstances. In general, Russians seem to be more positive towards West and EU than United States. In comparison to Americans, they are much more likely to say that Russia should be ally or a friend. In general, also, terrorism seems to be the only prime that has positive effect on both Russians and Americans. In the United States, also a threat of the nuclear war. And here I'm coming up to the specific tests that we made, the specific measurements that we made running through various possible compromise that we can base or suggest based on various kinds of considerations in mind. That we need to avoid catastrophic war between the two nuclear powers, that cooperation between the two countries could be beneficial for both nations, for Americans and Russians. What about concern for ordinary people, usual people? And what about fight with the common terrorist threat? So here is, I want to just quickly scan through the data for you and then come up to the major findings, to the major results. In general, Russia seems to be eager to compromise on common enemy of terrorism, as well as actually United States as well. But besides terrorism, in United States, people seem to be willing to compromise on trying to avoid nuclear disaster, nuclear war between the two countries. So this is the potential for American audience. With regards to some of the complicated issues, such as support for Donbas rebels, In Russia, we see that this support is malleable, considering usual people and common enemy being a terrorism. In terms of United States, no, there's no expectations for compromise on economic sanctions or Donbass. In general, if we talk about specific potential for compromise between between both nations, economy, Syria, Ukraine, unfortunately don't have much effect on both compromising on sanctions, and it doesn't have much change. It doesn't has much effect on United States. So the attitude towards these factors, economy or Ukraine, is pretty firm in the case of the United States. However, in general, even though there is relatively firm dispositions with regards to mutual perception between Americans and Russians, there is of course, there's certain limitations of where we can go here. There is certain ways, certain degrees of plasticity. There are certain ways where we can still find that common ground. Yes, the most influential frames, unfortunately, between us seem to be negative, especially if we talk about American case. But interestingly, the situation with Crimea seems to be to have much more effect on American public perception than election meddling, let alone political preferences of the audiences. But as for positive frames, even though there is, we cannot talk about very strong effect of both, of all factors which we tried to experiment with. There is some a possibility. There is some good news, such as, for example, addressing the common threat of terrorism, right? That both Americans and Russians seem to be interested in compromising together. And I want to emphasize, in the American case, it's also trying to avoid nuclear war over global scope. So this is something where Americans also seem to be much more willing to compromise. I wanted to go very quickly through it because we have taken most of the time of today's session, and to leave rather more time for your questions. I have much more tables for you following my slides. So if you have questions, I would be very glad to answer those. But I also want to emphasize that Henry Hale, the co-author, my colleague from George Washington University, is also present, and I'm sure he will be also very glad to participate in our discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olga. I was going to mention it. So since Henry is kindly with us, maybe you can just jump in and add something without a reference to this particular presentation or with reference to this presentation?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if there's much that I would add to what Olga said, except, I think the, general idea is just to, really try and explore the degree to which, public opinion is just baked in hostile, on both sides, and the degree to which it's responsive to relatively, kind of weak leadings. And I think one of the interesting findings is that, there is the ability, on both sides, but it seems like the hostility that we do see and the mistrust is not actually as deep as we often think it might be. And so, it kind of means that things can go both directions, right? I think kind of that's part of the big picture is people who want to kind of incite hostility on both sides can do it by, invoking the correct frames, the frames that would do that. But there's also opportunity to, open up willingness to consider, compromise and working together by focusing on those, kind of compromise-oriented frames. So I think that offers some hope. And again, there's a lot of detail and nuance involved on exactly how this can be done, the degree to which it can be done in each country. But that's sort of the big, I think, thing that I take away from it. And so, we're just still in the middle of trying to make sense of all of it and sort out all the details because it's a lot of data. But maybe I'll just stick to that, saying that, and then look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Henry. I do hope that our discussion today also helps you to find some other angle on to look at these excellent conclusions and calculations you made together with Olga. So we still have about 19 minutes for the discussion, and I will be very glad if our participants who are with us will join us for this part of our session.
So if I may begin, I got a private message that, let me just read it because we can have it for everyone here. So it said, thanks for the presentation. One question about HRI and Tajikistan case, especially about economic component. To my mind, there is one specific detail on this context. Tajik migrants in Russia and huge volumes of their remittances, they made up to 37 to 40% of its GDP and 3 times higher than foreign direct investment in the 5-year period. What is your vision of these details? So it's an excellent question from Mr. Babayev. And in the data here, this is not the complete sort of data set that I'm working on right now. This is the one that is comparable across countries for 2003 to 2017. What I would say about remittances, particularly from migrant laborers from Central Asia in Russia, is that this is, in fact, the main form of Russian economic investment in Central Asia. Without it, it would be very low, not zero, but we'd be talking about, like, for instance, Russian overseas development assistance in all of Central Asia is right around $100 million a year. That's sort of the usual amount. Remittances are much, much higher. Foreign direct investment is between those two. So part of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a positive for Russia, is having this open labor relationship with these countries from Central Asia. So in short, without remittances from migrant laborers in Russia to their home countries, the amount of Russian economic influence in Central Asia would be extremely low.
But Yuval, if I just may follow, but putting this question into your methodology, of bargaining between those weaker and those stronger within hierarchical structures, how would you assess the political impact or compared remittances and foreign direct investment in Russia, in, say, Tajikistan? Trying to explain myself. So the impact of Tajikistan migrants working on the Russian labor market is not only measured in terms of money, but also in terms of the social and political stability. Basically, we take these people from the streets of Dushanbe to the Moscow development spots. And that is another leverage, another advantage which Russia has within these constant bargaining for you are advocating.
Yes, so all of these things are true. So in the next iteration of the data, so the final thing of what I want this this index to look like is that each of these different categories, politics, economics, whatever, have so many indicators that any one particular one basically is drowned out by all the others. So as a statistical sort of thought, not to make any one particular indicator like remittances or foreign direct investment stand out compared to all the others. So that's basically where this is going. So I take the critique as something I'm working on right now. In terms of basically these pathways, there is a difference between sort of like what remittances do and what foreign direct investment does. The remittances is just the money that comes from country A to country B, from Russia to Tajikistan, but without essentially asking anything of either the Tajik side or the Russian side, because it's basically person to person. But when we have basically foreign direct investment from a Russian firm in Tajikistan, then it can bring in these government to government negotiations and relationships. And if there was more of that, more foreign direct investment compared to remittances, then we'd have a different set of opportunities for actually Tajikistan to negotiate with Russia how that Russian money comes into the country. And so we would have, and so that would be step one. If there was no other money coming into the country, nothing from, let's say, European Union, nothing from Germany, nothing from China, nothing from the United States, then we would have essentially this form of basically totally unequal relationship between Russia and China. But if we have foreign direct investment coming from Russia at the same time that Tajikistan has from China, from US, from European Union, or wherever else, then essentially the ability of Russia to determine the investment climate and the political climate of Tajikistan would decline, would be less powerful.
Okay, thank you. Sergey Alexandrovich, you joined us. I think it's one of the 100 online seminars. You take opportunity to join. This is a big pleasure for us. Please, please ask your question and give it.
Thank you. I'm sorry for being late. I mean, I'm living in the real world, and not in the world of theories. I mean, and outdated theories and views. I'm living in a village, in a very comfortable village, but they were repairing electricity. So for about 9 hours, I was living in the future, where it was nowhere. So no connections with the outside world. I mean, it was quite nice. I was reading excellent books. And that also contributed to my thinking. We are working on the presumptions which were created 10, 20, 30 years ago. What is positions of a country now? Control, influence. The less, my judgment is, the less Russia controls Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, the better it is for Russia. And whoever controls Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and I love these countries, of course, I mean, has a liability. For many, many years, we believed that control of Ukraine was extremely crucial for the viability of imperial or great Russia. But now we are looking at this situation from a different point. Ukraine, or in Soviet times especially, was a hugest net importer of resources, financial, political, economic, from Mother Russia. And we see in what conditions Ukraine is now, intellectually, economically, and where it goes. So my answer is, the less Russia controls Ukraine, the better. The only proviso, or the only if, is of course prevention of military control of other centers. So I'm going now back to the issue. We do not know where the things are going, but we know 2 or 3 things. One is China would be weaker. Second is because of this crisis, but probably less weaker than the United States. They will both lose. Third, the world will be even more chaotic. Then the question rises: he or she who controls, is he stronger or he is weaker in this new chaotic world? So if I am a Tsar, I would say to Russia, stay out as much as possible. Try to influence, countries in the middle. but not directly, and do not take any responsibility and wait. If the two factors which will determine the future world will be, first, will China, will the United States be able to overcome its anti-Chinese feelings or policies and try to cure the relationship? If not, we're in good shape, in excellent shape. The second unknown is whether China will be able to part from its Middle Kingdom mentality. If China parts from that mentality, I mean, we are fine because we will be friendly balancing China in Eurasia, but friendly. If China continues with or strengthens the element of Middle Kingdom in its policies, will be also friendly, but much less friendly balancing, building up relationships with countries like Turkey, Iran, India, Vietnam, Japan, and all others. I see only one problem with Russian foreign policy, and here I completely agree with you about, and that is the after effects of the huge economic crisis, which we are only starting to enter. Actually, it will be economic collapse worldwide, most probably. So if Russia goes through that, we are in good shape. I'm not sure. All the more that Russian government has been unwise to join the many other countries in the world in shutting down its economic activities for too long. Of course, it was humanistically very right, but rationally not exactly wise. We'll see. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sergei Alexandrovich. Well, your observations actually are very convincing that we are probably departing the times of the institutions and international and structural approaches to the international relations. So I'm happy to realize once again that this choice of topic for our session, the change of the foreign policy behavior, has some future, maybe for our future intellectual exercises. I see that in the chat we have a question for Andrei Krickovic.
Yes. Oh. Yes, yes. So I'll read the question. It's from Miss Eka Hobalaje, and she's asking, as you conduct the historical retrospective at the beginning of your presentation, and we take into account that the concept of Greater Europe and the concept of Greater Eurasia, sorry, I'm having trouble getting this, have some important points in common, and practically we could say that the first failed. What should be the real prospects of the concept of Greater Eurasian partnership, and how could modern conditions affect the process of building the Greater Eurasian space? So, well, I mean, I agree with many things that Sergei Alexandrovich said, and one of the things is, we, I guess, states are realizing the kind of you buy it, you break it, you buy it mentality, right? So, who wants to own some and have influence over some of these countries when they're more liabilities than they are assets? And so we really have to think of the world that's going to emerge after this COVID-19 crisis, and everybody will be turned inward to some extent in terms of trying to get their economies started. Hopefully there won't be return outbreaks or new viruses or what have you. We'll live in a fundamentally different world. So Russia, like all countries, may be turning inward post-crisis and not having the luxury of really kind of investing in this Greater Eurasian partnership. If I was asked this question before COVID-19, I would have probably stressed that, this kind of growing disparity in power and status between the two, right? Debbie Larson and Shevchenko, they came out with an article where they argued that this is a relatively stable status partnership because the two complement each other. Where Russia may be weaker in kind of finance, economic dynamism, China is strong, where China is weaker in terms of military and, diplomacy. Russia is the stronger one. But if there's a disparity between the two, and, this becomes more and more asymmetrical, and then also, China has some very different interests in terms of how it's going to kind of, take on the United States, maybe less willing to do so than Russia is. Russia gains some status in actually taking on the United States, that would be a point leading to the end of this kind of greater Eurasia as well. But it might be that Russia jumps to a new opportunity. And here's where I kind of maybe disagree a little bit with Yuval. Yuval had Russia going alone as kind of the worst option. But if we think of a world, let's say, accelerated towards some kind of struggle, U.S. decline accelerated by COVID-19 and possibly China rise accelerated by it, maybe Russia has this now opportunity to balance between the two, right? Be kind of the middleman, and this, leverage that position as still, independent power, and that would maybe turn it away from, investing in this greater Eurasia, and the status play would be more towards this. Not that, that the end of greater Eurasia or what have you, but most of the action would be in playing this kind of trilateral game. So I see those as factors that would maybe lead to end of greater Eurasia. Another one would also be that, I think there's an economic expectation that, greater Eurasia will aid Russia in economic modernization, breaking out of resource dependency, opening up markets to Asia, where, it can be competitive in things besides energy. Well, that's a tall order, that's a tremendous kind of economic transformation. So if there are disappointments in that happening, and we just see a replication of what the relationship is, resource appendage of Europe, now resource appendage of Asia, then also Russia would lose interest in this kind of greater Eurasia project as well.
I'm sorry. Great. There is a question from Fabienne. Fabienne, do you want to ask it directly, Yuval?
Yes, sure.
Yes, please, go ahead. Fabienne, from Ghent University.
Yes, from Belgium. Probably the only one from Europe at the moment in the session. Okay, so Yuval, I guess you already saw my question. So I was just wondering about the relative weight of the various models or components of hierarchy that you have, because to me it seems only hypothetically possible that these are equal in weights. So I was also then wondering, is it possible to identify conditions under which one model or one specific component trumps the other? Because to me that would be very interesting, if your framework allows for that.
Great, thank you, Fabienne. It's a good question. So when I was looking at the literature to see how have other people tried to measure great power competition on a material sense, how people have tried to measure hierarchy and so forth, there's a number of different hard power and soft power indices out there. Correlates of War has the Composite Index of National Capabilities. There is the Lowy Institute for Asia. There's a number of these. And I found that there's no one single one that is totally correct. All of them say, here is the one way to measure international affairs of country to country. So the reason that I gave basically 5 different models where everything is equal, 25% across, or basically 1/2, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, is to basically be explicit about saying ex ante, like ahead of time, we don't know what is the correct way to think about international affairs, because each of those things is in effect designed to not exactly test as of yet, but to speak to the different paradigms. The security one obviously speaks to realism. The economic one obviously speaks to liberalism, sort of writ large. The information one speaks to sort of constructivism. The diplomacy one speaks to this idea of just the great power politics of the day, where diplomacy, or of the 19th century, where diplomacy is key in terms of state-to-state interaction, which places more emphasis on leaders. I don't know, you don't know, none of us knows which one is the right way to think about international affairs, because if we did, we wouldn't have a discipline, we would just be technicians. So the reason I give 5 is to say, if you can have 5 different ways of explaining the world, but to sort of keep it even amongst them, I'm just going to give equal weightings. And that's basically the way that I try to approach the idea of measuring state-to-state interaction.
Excellent. Lev, if you are here, can you ask your question directly, but make it 5 times shorter?
All right. Thank you so much. Hello, my name is Lev Sokolchik, a PhD research fellow from Higher School of Economics. I would like to ask Yuval one question. On one your slide, you present and demonstrated the hierarchy and resilience index indicator: security, diplomatic, economic, and informational. Could the health system resilience and ability to cope with a pandemic threat without serious external support to consider as an important factor in the context of your research? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And obviously when I started this project, I was not thinking as much about public health as a measure of resilience. I'd say that the easiest way that I can think about it now is just assess something within, do countries export to each other sort of health devices or money specifically that is meant for public health in whichever other country? Because again, like remittances, foreign aid is in the current version of it, but because I didn't have enough data to compare across countries, I didn't want to give a misleading data until I'm confident in it myself. So certainly looking at public health interactions between 2 countries, that's something that I will pursue. I have not looked at it yet because like a lot of people, I just didn't know it was going to be as important. And what we can also see, and this is basically maybe a side comment to your question, is that we have had pandemics and viruses before, like even like in the past 10 years, 20 years, like the bird flu, swine flu, SARS, all these different ones. But in previous eras, there was much clearer source of international leadership from the United States working with these post-World War II international institutions, such as the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is sort of much more influenced by China now. That by itself is not good or bad. Like, I don't have any personal opinion on it. But what we've seen is that if these international institutions become objects of great power competition, then we'll have basically these national interests over international issues, in which we will in fact get less international coordination, because the international coordination might not reflect the great power interests of China or the US or whatever else. So that's something that we've observed, and I need to think more seriously about that, because we all do. But I don't have like a great answer for you right now, except to think about those issues in terms of pre-existing measures and indicators.
Okay, thank you, Yuval. My dear academic fellows, I'm very sorry we need to sum up this session. Yes, thank you very much to everybody. We've got several questions. We got excellent different angles looking at the transformations of Russian foreign policy behavior, especially in the wider Eurasian context. Our next exciting session is going to be next Monday, May 18. We have Fabienne there. We have another couple of colleagues, and we will speak about Europe, about the modern approaches and changes in studying of the European integration and European Union as an international phenomenon. So let me again thank you very much, all of you, and have a nice rest of the day, evening, or night in case of Andre, or wherever you are. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye. Thank you.